Hi everyone, it's William Lieb back with this week's installment of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia, my YouTube series on the Romanov Grand Dukes and the relationship between the Romanov Dynasty and the Russian state. And we haven't gotten to the Grand Dukes yet. We're moving right along into the mid 18th century now, and the Grand Dukes are soon to come. But meanwhile, I'm doing kind of an overview of what was going on in this period prior to Grand Dukes coming into play and developing a role for themselves. So the 18th century until the very end was pretty much without Grand Dukes, with the dynasty very much on the edge of extinction until, as I say, toward the end. So it's quite a blustery day here today, a nice blustery crisp October day in the Portland area, so I'm bundled up a little bit, but I love doing these outside, so we will carry on. So in last week's episode, we talked about the ill-fated Emperor Peter III, who was, like his bride, a person, Catherine, who would become Catherine the Great. They were both raised in Germany, not the country, which didn't exist yet, but in part sort of the conglomeration of German kingdoms and grand duchies and dukedoms. They were both, raised thinking of themselves as Germans. But they had the two of them had a very different response to being brought into Russia. And in Peter's case, his aunt brought him, his aunt, who was Peter the Great's daughter, Elizabeth. She was the empress, and she named him her heir and brought him to Russia as an adolescent to prepare him for his future role as the Russian emperor. And she also brought Catherine in to be his bride, and Catherine too was an adolescent when she came to Russia, but Catherine really embraced her role as a link in the chain of the Petrine heritage, the heritage of Peter the Great in Russia in the dynasty, whereas Peter III still showed strong preferences for Germany, to it even going so far as to conquering to returning some conquered territory to Germany, some territory that had been conquered by Russia during the 7 Years' War was simply returned to Germany. And so in this new post-Petrine world, where the prestige of Russia as an empire and a European great power was greatly emphasized, that was an absolute no-no. And there were other problems with Peter as well, and I'm a little bit out of date, because the text that I'm mainly dealing with is my own dissertation, which was let's see, it was never published, because I really wanted to go, and my intention all along had been to go to Russia and spend a long time there looking specifically at service records, and so I kept putting it off and putting it off. But when it was defended and accepted and I got my PhD was 2000, the year 2000. So it's a bit out of date, and I'm told that there have been some revisionist histories about Peter III, criticizing the primary sources that were formerly used as sort of taking at face value things that people said about Peter, people who didn't like Peter, and there were all kinds of allegations that, at least the time that I was working on my PhD, were very much accepted as fact about Peter. One was that he was most likely unable to father children. he had some kind of surgery on his genitals, and it seemed like he was just not going to be able to have children. And so the Empress Elizabeth turned a blind eye to Catherine taking lovers, and the minute an heir was born, little Paul, Elizabeth took him away from his parents and was raising him herself as the future emperor to be. And so Paul was 8 when his father died. When Peter III, Elizabeth had died, Peter III had come to the throne. He was ousted by the elite servitors of the time with the collusion of Catherine, who would become Catherine the Great. Paul was 8 years old at the time this happened, and unfortunately for him, whether his father was Peter III or not, unfortunately for him, he did not inherit the Romanov stature. Romanov men tended to be tall. Peter the Great himself was almost 7 feet tall, and or the physical beauty. Peter the Great was a good-looking man. I haven't paid that much attention with the next emperors and empresses that came immediately following Peter the Great, but Paul was, by conventional terms of what is an attractive person and what is not, he fell short. So you can find, I don't have a picture of any of the drawings or paintings of him here at hand, but you can certainly see those online if you Google him, and you can see that, yeah, he's a funny looking guy, and he was also short, and those things did not help him at all. So before we dive into the actual text from my dissertation, I just want to give you an overview of what has led up to this. So at this point in Russian history, in the mid 18th century, the things have shifted. So originally, the servitors were the reluctant ones. The nobility were the ones who were reluctant to adjust to the modernization of the Russian state. But Peter succeeded so well that the servitors themselves, things shifted. And at this time in the 18th century, the servitors saw themselves as the champions and the protectors of Russian prestige and the Russian state and Russia's honor. And they were looking with a critical eye upon Russia's rulers. And if the rulers failed to live up to that, then that was going to be a big problem, because the servitors felt the need to, as I said, to be the champions of the state. So Peter III, there were other things about him that were problematic with his image, not only his preference for Germany and things German, but he also came across as a frivolous and kind of silly man, and possibly even crazy, possibly even mentally ill. And he, for instance, had these life-size dolls in soldiers' uniforms that he played with. And so, yeah, he was not living up to Peter the Great's standard, to this high bar that had been established by Peter the Great. So that was another reason why, the servitors felt the need to get rid of him. So then there's this idea of meritocracy, which was very dear to Peter the Great's heart, as we've talked about. The idea that everybody should prove their worth by making their way up through the ranks and never attaining a rank that they weren't well suited for and capable of seriously carrying out. Well, this was something that you had a bit of a divide within the elite servitors. So there were two sort of competing motives within the circle of elite servitors. So on the one hand, you did have a real desire for professionalism. you did have people starting to value their roles and establish an identity as professional civil servants, and more importantly, professional military men who were truly competent. And on the other hand, you had those who were simply wanting the aristocracy to prevail in this power struggle between the aristocracy and the autocracy. And they wanted to have more control over ruling the Russian state, and saw the dynasty as a rival institution in that sense. They didn't want the dynasty to go away, but they wanted it to be not more of a ruling, not on an autocratic basis. Sorry, I'm being so inarticulate here. Okay, so you have that sort of developing fault line between the servitors as well, and you would certainly have more of those with the professional viewpoint in the lower nobility than in the aristocracy. But they all sort of converged at this point. They were all converging on the desire to never see Russia humiliated or judged as barbaric or backward by the other European states again. Okay, so when we turn to Paul himself, who was credited with being the son of Peter III, and so he had the patronymic Petrovich, Pavel Petrovich, and he was, as I say, he was 8 years old when his father died, or seemingly was killed, was murdered. And instead of becoming the emperor himself, which would have been the tradition throughout Europe of having male primogeniture, so when the emperor died, his eldest son, and not his wife, would become the next ruler. But in post-Petrine 18th century Russia, as you know, if you've watched the previous one of these, there was no law saying that an eldest son must succeed. There was no legal basis for that. And in fact, Peter had, in 1722, promulgated a succession law that allowed the emperor to choose his own heir, regardless of gender or even of blood, for that matter. And although Peter had not designated an heir, he probably wouldn't have chosen the wife who was colluding with these elite officers in getting rid of him and causing his death. But there was nothing to stop Catherine from saying that she was the rightful heir. So Paul did not actually even have law on his side when his mother decided to push him aside and become the empress. And, they didn't have a strong bond because he had been taken away from her. And I don't think she would have been probably a hands-on mother anyway. And so Paul's reign, very brief reign, because he came to the throne in 1896 and he died in 1796, and he died in 1801. His very brief reign was characterized really by his grudge, by his mommy issues, we might say nowadays, and he had been embittered by what had happened, both because he certainly believed that Peter was his father, who'd been killed by his mother, sort of a reverse Oedipus complex, you could say. And, also because he had just been pushed out of the way and didn't come to the throne until he was in his 40s. And he loathed his mother, and one of the first things his mother did was take his children away, take his eldest 2 sons away. He would have 2 more sons after his mother's death, but in the meantime, his 2 eldest sons were taken away from him and his wife and raised by their doting grandmother. Okay, so By the time he became emperor, when he was 40s, he was seriously alienated from the elite officer corps, and he had dealt with the situation with his mother by forming his own body of troops as a sort of counter body of regiments and troops, a counter or alternate to the real elite servitors, the real Guards officer corps, his Gatchina regiment, his Gatchina troops. And so that definitely was against him, and the fact that he was physically not attractive was against him, and the fact, I'm sure, in the eyes of the population, the fact that he was a man, but a woman, never mind that she was his mother, a woman had succeeded in pushing him out of the way. Okay, so let's get down to the text. I'll close this up. And some of this will be redundant, but, you know, these are points that I can't emphasize enough in relation to, believe it or not, to how the Grand Dukes functioned later, and we'll get into that. Okay, so Paul Petrovich, like his father, offended his elite servitors in numerous ways. To begin with, as we know, he was unable to reflect Russia's glory physically. So you don't have to take my word for that, because it was something that you find in primary sources of people who were alive at that time. And one of my biggest sources is by a horse guards officer named N.A. Sablukov. And he perceived an essential difference between past monarchs whose shortcomings and eccentricities were acceptable, and Paul, who aroused contempt. So this would apply actually to Peter III as well. So these other rulers could be forgiven because their personal vanity, their eccentricities were, in the eyes of these servitors under Paul, who were looking back, whether rightly or wrongly, they tied those eccentricities inextricably to the greatness of the state. For instance, Peter the Great had certainly been an eccentric fellow, but all of his eccentricities and personal vanities seemed to work actually to the benefit of the state and the greatness of the state, and their deeds sprang from a feeling of ardent love for the motherland. So that's a quote from Sablukov. And Paul did not seem to Sablukov to share this patriotic spirit, and that it was, you know, at least in part, as he perceived it, tied to the fact that he also didn't embody the greatness of the state. So he was, let's see, so again quoting Sablukov, the majority of the representatives of this house, both male and female, have always been distinguished by remarkable beauty and physical strength. Whereas, that's the end of the quote. So he goes on to refer to Paul as a Tsar cripple, literally, not meaning that he was crippled, but that his physical presentation was something crippling to him. And no allowances were made for his extravagances. Moreover, his behavior often made him seem ridiculous in the eyes of his aristocratic subjects, accustomed as they had been to Catherine's majesty. I. Nelidova, an imperial lady-in-waiting, believed the emperor's insistence upon playing the common and petty drill master undermined his autocratic dignity. And that's a bit ironic, because that was something Peter the Great himself had done with these so-called toy regiments that turned into very real elite regiments, the Preobrazhensky and Ismailovsky infantry regiments. So Peter had enjoyed that role of working his way up through the ranks and then drilling those troops, and future emperors would enjoy that as well, like Nicholas I. But at that time, the fact that Paul wanted to do this rather shocked the elite servitors who saw it as beneath the imperial dignity. So, Paul's dispute with the Guards officer corps was the final fatal element in his policy. The steps he took were designed to humiliate this body, to undermine the security of its members, and destroy its corporate identity. He greatly preferred the Gatchina troops, which he had formed and drilled during Catherine's reign. These units, led by low-born officers, were allowed to appropriate the names of the Guards' regiments. Sablukov describes how Paul stood them before us like a model of perfection which we should imitate blindly. Meanwhile, the Guards were forced to witness the dismemberment of one of their most prestigious regiments, the Horse Guards. And so this was, big problem. Paul saw it as being a nest of traitors, and so he got rid of it and apportioned the soldiers and officers out to other bodies, even though the Horse Guards was commanded by one of his own sons, his second son, Grand Duke Constantine. Okay, Paul's behavior towards the Guards officer corps overall makes sense only when viewed in the context of his hatred for his mother's regime. He clearly considered the nobility in general and the Guards officer corps in particular as Catherine's willing accomplices in the murder of Peter III, a man whom it suited him to idealize, his father, and by choosing to look upon Russia's service elite as a rival political entity, he contributed greatly to its politicization. So he himself was really to blame in increasing the width of this fault line and bringing it close enough to the surface that it was causing real tremors. Okay. So, let's see, finally, even outside the Guards, considerable concern arose as to whether Paul could remain on the throne without leading Russia into disaster. His position as would-be Grand Master of the Knights of Malta influenced him to the extent that he adopted an irrational attitude toward foreign policy, leading Russia toward a clash with Great Britain. A contemporary witness, Countess Golovina, wrote, "The nation was shocked to see its emperor more proud of being Grand Master of the Order of Malta than of being sovereign of Russia." Okay, so let's see. Theoretically, there was no ideological dispute between the Tsar and his servitors. Both considered themselves upholders of the Petrine heritage. So this wasn't a matter of them having clashing ideologies. It was a matter of each side thinking that I am the champion, and each side thinking this other group is not actually behaving in a way consistent with that ideology. So Paul had been raised to look upon Peter I as a role model, and long before his accession voiced the conviction that he could have no other interest than those of the state. But he was unable to realize this ideal both because of his eccentricities and animosities and because of his lack of the progressive qualities which his servitors associated with Peter. So he was not a modernizer, and they wanted Russia to continue to modernize and be at the same level of modernization as the most advanced of the European states. So Paul's autocratic ideology was anachronistic insofar as it had a strongly religious foundation. He had been inculcated by his spiritual instructor with the Muscovite conception that the sovereign was a living manifestation of God's will, and he took this concept far too literally as a justification for whatever whim might seize him, believing that all his impulses were, by definition, good for the state. Okay, so that's going back to that pre-Petrine Muscovite mythos and ideal that we've talked about. The elite servitors, for their part, were only too willing to claim the protectorship of the empire's interests as their own moral high ground. Thus, a dispute which was in essence a power struggle between autocrat and nobility took on greater ideological significance in the eyes of many of those involved. The guards in particular were imbued with the Petrine heritage. Peter I had so far succeeded in establishing the link between service and the state that the elite officers, who made up almost two-thirds of the conspirators identified in Paul I's murder, with their highly developed sense of corporate identity, were prepared to equate any slight or threat to themselves as a slight or threat to the empire, and from this it was but a short leap to assuming a right to act, a moral right to act as the voice of the state, thus usurping autocratic prerogative. Other disgruntled members of the service elite could both share and exploit this tendency amongst the officers. Pyotr Polin, who along with Nikita Panin originated the conspiracy against Paul, presented himself as a, quote, disinterested state servant acting to protect society. After the assassination, Adam Czartoryski found the Zubov brothers, whose role had likewise been crucial, and this is a quote, convinced that they had done a great service to Russia. So this was Adam Czartoryski was one of these elite officers, although he was Polish, and this was his personal assessment of how they really felt. Not that it was just a pretext, but that. So all of these names you're going to find out about these people when we talk about the Grand Ducal rule, because two of the Grand Dukes were actually involved in the murder of Paul I. And I should have started out remarking that Paul was one of three emperors of Russia who were murdered in the 18th century. He was the last of them to be murdered. Of course, Nicholas II was murdered by from the lower layers, from beneath, and so the three in the 18th century, these were all, two of them were killed by the elite servitors, and one, Empress Elizabeth, killed her rival to the throne, little Ivan the Fifth. But okay, now is not the time to go into that. Sorry, I'm beginning to fall apart here a little bit, and there was so I will stop there. But I want to give you some names if you want to do further research on this. And unfortunately, these are works in Russian. If they haven't been translated yet within the last 24 years, they should be translated. I wish I had the time to undertake that myself. So we've already heard about Sablukov, and if you want the full reference to that, you can find it in the previous video. And now we also have a work by E.S. Shumagorsky, and writing about Yekaterina Ivanovna Nelidova, who was a contemporary of Paul's and who was there overseeing this all. She lived from 1758 to 1839, so on into the 19th century, and the work is called Ocherk iz Historia Imperatora Pavla. Okay, and it was published in St. Petersburg in 1898, so a little under a century after Peter's death. And the title is just saying that it's work from the history of the Emperor Paul. Okay, and what else do we have? Were there any other I wanted to mention? A very, very valuable work, Adam Czartoryski's Memoirs of Prince Adam Czartoryski and his correspondence with Alexander I, who became emperor after Paul. It was published in London in 1888, and it's a multi-volume work. So these are just really first-rate sources. So forgive me, as always, for rambling and losing track of things a little bit. I'm hoping I'm not being too repetitive. I probably am. I have this vague memory of having gone over this Paul material before, but I think it was just a matter of having, yes, gone over it, but then not having a time to include it in the previous video. But anyway, as I say, you really can't emphasize this stuff enough when you come into the actual part of our study of what the Grand Dukes themselves did. So we have just a little bit left that I want to say as an overview of Paul. And then we'll be going on to section 2 of my dissertation, the first generation of Romanov Grand Dukes. So we'll finally get to the Grand Dukes themselves, and we will be dealing specifically with Catherine II's reign. So not with Catherine as a person in a biographical sense, but what was going on during her reign in relation to these Petrine aspects of meritocracy and of the state above all, and also with our first 2 Grand Dukes, Paul's sons Alexander and Constantine. Alexander as an heir to the throne really, again, is not the emphasis of this study. So Constantine will be the first Grand Duke who was raised as a Grand Duke and who would be the pioneer of Grand Ducal rule in Russia, Constantine Pavlovich. And what an interesting figure. After Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, who was a 20th century Grand Duke, Constantine Pavlovich is probably my favorite, and in the sense of being one of the most interesting, and to me, I have great sympathy for him and the difficult position he was in, and so many interesting things going on with him. But come back, for I might be able to just say a few words finishing up about Paul in the next video, and then dive into Catherine II's reign. So interesting stuff, and I hope to see you then. Bye.